Welcome to the Servants of Grace podcast hosted by Dave Jenkins. Our podcast exists to provide trustworthy expository messages through the Bible and faithful answers to your theology questions. Now, for today's episode, let's join our host, Dave Jenkins.
Well, welcome back to the Servants of Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this show. And on today's episode, a listener writes in, and they have a great question. And the question is, how do we know that the New Testament is reliable? Now, I want to state something up front here about this question and answering this question. Some of you are going to think, well, there's a lot that you left out. Now, I want to say there are so many books written that answer questions like these. But on this show, I want to be very clear. I'm aiming to answer questions like these and others in about 5 to 15, 20 minutes. And so we're going to be pushing that 15 minute, maybe even 20 minutes in answering this question. So I want to be upfront about that because a question like this, you could spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, even longer answering a question like this. So my answer is going to be brief, it's going to be concise, and hopefully it's going to be helpful. So the question is, how do we know that the New Testament is reliable? Well, first, the New Testament writers included embarrassing details about themselves. And one of the ways historians can tell whether an author is telling the truth is to test what he says by the principle of embarrassment. This principle assumes that any details embarrassing to the author are probably true. Why? Because the tendency of most authors is to leave out anything that makes them look bad. So how does the New Testament measure up to the principle of embarrassment? Well, let's put it this way. If you and your friends were concocting a story that you wanted to pass off as the truth, would you make yourself look like a dim-witted, uncaring, rebuked, doubting coward? Of course not. But that's exactly what we find in the New Testament. If you were a New Testament writer, would you include these embarrassing details if you were making up a story? Would you write that one of your primary leaders was called Satan by Jesus, denied the Lord 3 times, hid during the crucifixion, and was later corrected on a theological issue? Would you depict yourself as uncaring, bubbling cowards and the women whose testimony was not even admissible in court as the brave ones who stood by Jesus and later discovered the empty tomb? Would you admit that some of you, the 11 remaining disciples, doubted the very Son of God after he had proven himself risen to all of you? Well, of course not. In short, we don't have enough faith to believe that the New Testament writers included all of those embarrassing details in a made-up story. The best explanation is they were really telling the truth, warts and all. Second, the New Testament writers including embarrassing details and difficult sayings of Jesus. Now, the New Testament writers, the point here is they were honest about Jesus. Not only do they record self-incriminating details about themselves, they also record embarrassing details about their leader, Jesus, that seem to place him in a bad light. Jesus is not believed by his own brothers in John 7:5. He is thought to be a deceiver in John 7:12. He is deserted by many of his followers in John 6:66. He turns off Jews who had believed in him in John 8:30 through 31, to the point that they wanted to stone him in John 8:59. He's called a drunkard in Matthew 11:19, a madman in John 10:20, and demon-possessed in Mark 3:22, and John 7:20, and John 8:48. This is certainly not a list of events and qualities the New Testament writers would choose if they were trying to depict Jesus as the perfect, sinless God-man. Nor are these qualities congruent with the Jewish expectation that the Messiah would come to free them from political oppression. So in addition to embarrassing details, there are several difficult sayings attributed to Jesus that the New Testament writers would not have included if they were making up a story about Jesus being God. Again, the best explanation is that the New Testament writers were not playing fast and loose with the facts, but were extremely accurate in recording exactly what Jesus said and exactly what Jesus did. Third, the New Testament writers left in demanding sayings of Jesus. And so if the New Testament writers were making up a story, they certainly didn't make up a story that made life easier for them. This Jesus had some very demanding standards. The Sermon on the Mount, for instance, does not appear to be a human invention. All of the commands in it are difficult or impossible for human beings to keep and seem to go against the natural best interests of the men who wrote them down. They certainly are contrary to the desires of many today who want a religion of spirituality that has no moral demands. Fourth, the New Testament writers carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own. Now, even though quotation marks did not exist in the first century Greek, the New Testament writers distinguished Jesus' words very clearly. Most red letter editions of the Bible are identical, illustrating how easy the New Testament writers made it to see what Jesus said and what he didn't say. Now, why do we cite this as evidence of their trustworthiness? Because it would have been very easy for the New Testament writers to solve first century theological disputes by putting words into Jesus' mouth. After all, if you were making up the Christianity story and trying to pass it off as the truth, wouldn't you simply make up more quotes from Jesus to convince stubborn people to see things your way? Think how convenient it would have been for them to end all debate on controversial issues such as circumcision, obeying the law of Moses, speaking in tongues, women in the church, and on by merely making up quotes from Jesus. Now, instead of pulling rank in this way, the New Testament writers seem to stay true to what Jesus said and didn't say. Fifth, the New Testament writers include events related to the resurrection that they would not have invented. So in addition to the inclusion of embarrassing details regarding they and themselves, the New Testament writers record events related to the resurrection that they would not have inserted if they had invented the story. These include the burial of Jesus. The New Testament writers record that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling council that had sentenced Jesus to die for blasphemy. This is not an event that they would have made up. The first witnesses, all four Gospels say women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the first to learn of the resurrection. Now, one of these women was Mary Magdalene, who Luke admits had been demon-possessed in Luke 8:2. This would have never been inserted in a made-up story. Now, not only would a once demon-possessed person make a questionable witness, but women in general were not considered reliable witnesses in that first century culture. In fact, a woman's testimony carried no weight in a court of law. So, if you were making up a resurrection story in the first century, you would avoid women witnesses and make yourself the brave men, first ones to discover the empty tomb and the risen Jesus. Citing the testimony of women, especially demon-possessed women, would only hurt your attempt to pass off the lie as the truth. 6. The New Testament writers include more than 30 historically confirmed people in their writings. This is a crucial point that bears repeating. The New Testament documents cannot have been invented because they contain too many historically confirmed characters. The New Testament writers would have blown their credibility with their contemporary audiences by implicating real people in a fictional story, especially people of great notoriety and power. 7. The New Testament writers include divergent details. Now, critics are quick to cite the apparent contradictory gospel accounts as evidence that the gospels can't be trusted for accurate information. For example, Matthew says there was one angel at the tomb of Jesus, while John mentions two. Isn't this a contradiction that blows the credibility of these accounts into the water? No, exactly the opposite is true. Divergent detail actually strengthen the case that these are eyewitness accounts. Well, how so? First, let's point out that the angel accounts are not contradictory. Matthew does not say there was only one angel at the tomb. The critic has to add a word to Matthew's account to make it contradict John's. Now, why why did Matthew mention only one if two angels were really there? For the same reason, two different newspaper reporters covering the same event choose to include details in their stories. Two independent eyewitnesses rarely see all the same details and will never describe an event in exactly the same words. They're going to record the same major event, i.e., Jesus rose from the dead, but may differ on the details, meaning how many angels were at his tomb. In fact, when a judge hears two witnesses giving exactly the same word-for-word testimony, what does that judge rightly assume? Collusion. The witness got together beforehand to make their stories agree. So it's perfectly reasonable that Matthew and John differ. They are both recording eyewitness testimony. The eighth point, the New Testament writers challenge their readers to check out verifiable facts, even facts about miracles. Now, in his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul declares that he previously performed miracles for them. And speaking of his own qualifications as an apostle, somebody who speaks for God, Paul reminds the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 12:12, the things that mark an apostle, signs, wonders, and miracles were done among you with great perseverance. Now, why would Paul write this to the Corinthians unless he really had done miracles for them? He would have destroyed his credibility completely by asking them to remember miracles that he never did for them. So the only plausible conclusion is that 1, Paul really was an apostle of God. 2, he therefore really had the ability to confirm his apostleship by performing miracles. And 3, he had displayed this ability openly to the Corinthians. The ninth point, the New Testament writers describe miracles like other historical events with simple, unembellished accounts. Embellished and extravagant details are strong signs that a historical account has legendary elements, meaning they're fictional. The New Testament resurrection account contains nothing like this. The Gospels give matter-of-fact, almost bland descriptions of the resurrection. And if the resurrection were a made-up story designed to convince skeptics, then the New Testament writers certainly would have made up their accounts longer and with more detail. In fact, they would have said that they witnessed Jesus physically rising from the dead. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't even say anything at all about the dramatic theological implications of the resurrection. And John reports those implications in just one sentence in John 20:31. This point about the theological restraint of the gospel writers deserves amplification. It indicates that the gospel writers were concerned about getting the history correct, not inventing some new kind of theology. The 10th point, the New Testament writers abandoned their long-held sacred beliefs and practices, adopted new ones, and did not deny their testimony under persecution or threat of death. Now, finally, in addition to abandoning long-held sacred institutions and even adopting new ones, the New Testament writers suffered persecution and death when they could have been saved themselves by recanting. If they had made up the resurrection story, they certainly would have said so when they were about to be crucified: Peter, stoned, James, or beheaded, Paul. But no one recanted. 11 out of the 12 were martyred for their faith. The only survivor was John, who was exiled to the Greek island of Patmos. Why would they die for a known life? So we have all these reasons to support the idea that the New Testament writers relentlessly stuck to the truth of God's word. And why wouldn't they? What would motivate them to lie, embellish, or even exaggerate away? What did they possibly have to gain? They only gained persecution and death for testifying as they did. In other words, the New Testament writers had every motive to deny New Testament events, not to invent, to embellish, or exaggerate them. Again, it wasn't as if they needed a new religion. When Jesus arrived, most of the New Testament writers were devout Jews who thought that Judaism was the one true religion and they were God's chosen people. Something dramatic must have happened to jolt them out of their dogmatic slumbers and into a new belief system that promised them nothing but earthly trouble. In light of this, we don't have enough faith to be skeptics concerning the New Testament, and this is why it is reliable. But we need to say more than this. The idea that the Gospels and the epistles were not written down until 2 or 3 centuries after the death of Jesus is, to say it this way, yesterday's scholarship. Ignatius, who was martyred around the year 115 AD, wrote of the apostles' letters and the Gospels as the New Testament. This was typical of all the early church leaders who acknowledged only the four Gospels for the life and teaching of Jesus. By 150 AD, the Muratorian canon listed the books accepted by the Universal Church, and it included the four Gospels and all 13 letters of Paul. In 1972, a liberal scholar, John A.T. Robinson, published a detailed study of each book of the books of the New Testament and concluded that every single one of them must have been completed before the year 70 AD. Now, in addition, he condemned the sheer scholarly laziness, he said, of those who assume a late date for the New Testament, and added this when he said these words: "It is sobering to discover how little basis there is for many of the dates confidently assigned by modern experts to the New Testament documents. We may confidently claim that the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament were written down by the traditionally accepted authors who lived in the first century." Now, the Gospels records bear all the hallmarks of authentic eyewitness accounts, and here's just 3 points. Philip told Nathanael about Jesus, stating this in John 1:45 says, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." No one writing in the 2nd or 3rd century would have invented that. Nazareth is not even mentioned in the Old Testament, and the Jews never associated it with the coming Messiah. The most natural introduction would have been Jesus of Bethlehem, since that town had strong messianic connections, as in Micah 5:2. Besides, why say the son of Joseph when, well before the 2nd century, only the heretics doubted that Jesus was really the Son of God? Well, the only explanation for these 2nd century gaffes, supposed, is that the New Testament accurately records what Philip accurately said. Now, one day, Jesus visited the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. John reports this in John 12:3. Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Now, why does the author even mention the fragrance of the oil? Surely there is no great theological truth to be learned from this statement. However, the mention of this detail, it testifies to the account's authenticity. C.S. Lewis stated that the art of inventing little irrelevant details to make an imaginary scene more convincing is a purely modern art. He says, as a literary historian, he argues, "I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I have read a great deal of legend, and I am quite clear they are not the same sort of thing." If the later writers wanted their readers to believe that Jesus is a Son of God and the Lord of life, then his journey to Golgotha appeared to be a disaster. He stumbled and fell and was too weak to carry the crossbeam. And why make up that seemingly despairing cry from the cross? Matthew 27:46 says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So many details of Christ's final week, the entry into Jerusalem, the beating and crucifixion, and the claim of a resurrection open Christians up to ridicule. The Jews were offended, the Greeks mocked, and the Romans drew graffiti of a donkey-headed man on a cross. Why make it all up, we must ask? A witness has a right to be believed unless he is proved to be false, and if the quality of his life matches the high morality of his teaching, though he must have strong reason before we malign the integrity of his account. Now, as with the Old Testament, archaeology continually confirms the accuracy of the New Testament historical record. The account of the Roman census recorded in Luke 2 is well known. What is not so well known is that it was assumed by some that a Roman emperor would never issue an order for a census where all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Then a papyrus decree was discovered in Egypt that was an order for a Roman census in Egypt at the time of Trajan in 104 AD, which mirrors the order of Augustus recorded in Luke 2. The prefect Gaius Vibus Maximus ordered all those in his area to return to their own homes for the purpose of a census. Now, believe it or not, it was at one time suggested that Pilate was not a real figure of history because he was the only known reference to him that came from the New Testament. Well, then in the late 1950s, an inscription was found at Caesarea that dedicated a theater built by Pilate to the honor of Tiberius. Although half the stone tablet is destroyed, the rest is clear, which says, "The Tiberius, which Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, dedicated." The stone had been recycled to be used as part of a stairway for the remodeled theater in the 3rd century, but that's not all. The British Museum in London displays a small bronze coin minted by, wait for it, Pontius Pilate while he was governor of Judea. It carries the date of the 17th year of Tiberius, which would have been around 30 to 31 AD, perhaps the very year of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, at the time of Paul's travels, each city has its own town council, known by different titles from town to town. Only a contemporary and careful writer would record them accurately. An example of the accuracy of Luke, the writer of Acts as a historian, was found in 1877 when a block of marble rescued from becoming a builder's rubble at Thessalonica, it proved to be an inscription of the civic leaders in the city sometime in the 2nd century. They are referred to as polytiarchs. This is exactly the word translated as rulers of the city in Acts 17:6 and Acts 17:15. Now, we could say much more about the stones, but let a scholar have the last word. Sir William Ramsay was a bucket and spade archaeologist who spent his entire life digging around in modern-day Turkey, the land of Paul's travels. He was a very bright man with 3 honorary fellowships from Oxford and 9 honorary doctorates from British, Continental, and American universities. He was a one-time professor at Oxford and Aberdeen universities. He was awarded the Victorian Medal of the Royal Geographic Society in 1906 and was a founding member of the British Academy. He was even knighted in 1906 for his service to archaeology. And after a lifetime of painstaking research as a historian and archaeologist, this was his conclusion. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. He then added, Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as to believe it. Well, I want to thank you for listening or watching to today's episode of the Servants of Grace podcast. Until next time, may the Lord richly bless you and keep you.
Thank you for listening to the Servants of Grace podcast today. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, leave a rating on the app, and share our episode with your friends and family. If you'd like to, you can follow us on Instagram at Servants of Grace, on Twitter at Servants of Grace, or by searching Servants of Grace on Facebook. You can also find this podcast on the front page of our website at servantsofgrace.org.